Hello and welcome back to our podcast series, The Heart of the Matter. And today we're very fortunate. We have our first ever guest, actually, our first guest on the podcast series. I'm very pleased to welcome Bronwyn Redden and Katie Barclay. We're going to introduce them before we kick off today to give you a little bit more information on their backgrounds and just why we are so excited that they've been able to join us today. So I'll start with Katie. Katie Barclay is Deputy Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence in the History of Emotions and Associate Professor and Head of Department in History at the University of Adelaide. Her research expertise covers the history of emotions and family life, the history of subjectivity and identity creation, especially as that pertains to gender, and histories of Britain, particularly Scotland and Ireland, from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Now, I believe Katie is currently working on a project on how accounting practices shape the self during the Industrial Revolution, and that's funded by an ARC discovery project. So there's a lot of exciting things I just mentioned there. I'll hand over to Michael to introduce Bronwyn.
Thank you, Claire. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr Bronwyn Redden. She's a research fellow in the Faculty of Arts and Education at Deakin University. She completed a PhD in history at the University of Melbourne and publishes on gender and emotion in 17th century French fairy tales. The research published in her book, Love, Power and Gender in 17th Century French Fairy Tales, was supported by funding from the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions. That is a tongue twister of a book title, that one, but it sounds fascinating. Welcome, Bronwyn.
Thank you. Thank you. And we're very excited because they're both here to have a chat with us about their edited collection, The Feeling Heart. Thank you. Fabulous book there in medieval and early modern Europe, meaning, embodiment and making. So as you know, Claire, Michael and myself have a very keen interest in hearts from a multi-interdisciplinary sort of perspective. But what we really want to know is what sparked your interest in the feeling heart?
This is, I guess, I have a personal interest because I started out life as a historian of marriage, and my people, as I like to call them, the people that I study, often referred to each other as sweetheart, dear heart. That was a very common sort of metaphor for love. And so I didn't talk a lot about that in my first book and my PhD, but I had been thinking about, what is this thing with the heart, and we should do more on this. And then Bronwyn and I both attended a conference together, and we sat in a whole lot of panels, and this was a History of Emotions conference where people were talking about hearts and about things like the conversion and the converted heart. So that's when God enters your heart and gives you a religious kind of experience. But we just went to like several of these panels, and it was more and more hearts, and we were like, we should do something in hearts, and so we did.
I think that's a really nice way of putting it, Katie. And I had a similar sort of entry into the heart in the sense that my contribution to the edited collection and sort of the paper I gave as part of that collection came out of my PhD research, which is it focused on love and fairy tales in 17th century France. But what I found was I was on a research trip to the National Library in France in 2014, and I found this amazing tiny little book, and I'm sort of talking in terms of size, and it was by Charles Porous, who is known for writing fairy tales, was not actually the focus of my research because I was focusing on the group of women who wrote really interesting fairy tales at that time. But I sort of was doing a sweep. I'm like, any document that might be relevant, because I've flown 24 hours to get here, I'm going to read everything. And then I found this tiny little book which had handwritten annotation in it, sort of summarizing the reader's opinion on it. And it was about this battle between love and friendship for control of the heart. And I just found it fascinating. And it didn't fit in my PhD, but I just wanted to do something with it. So I did a conference paper, and then Katie heard it and a bunch of others. And then we thought, let's do something more.
These are just two amazing stories, actually. I kind of want to know a little bit more about both. I'm wondering, Katie, if you can elaborate on any findings about the origin of the sweetheart, dear heart kind of terminology.
Well, I think that's, I guess, what we hope that the book helps to contribute to in a way, is So for medieval and early modern people in Europe, the heart is just such an important icon, and it's so filled with meaning, especially in a romantic context, that it just becomes a kind of widely used reference, particularly for love, but actually for lots of other emotions as we end up exploring. And so I think for the similar reasons that we use those expressions today, that because the heart has all this meaning and it has the associations that you want it to have, people use it in their love letters and they refer to each other by those terms. But when you start to think about it, you stop and go, ooh, what does it mean to say somebody's your dear heart or your sweetheart? You know, it's kind of gruesome in some ways.
Yeah, and actually it reminds me of Bronwyn, your research on fairy tales. I mean, there's lots of kind of almost gruesome storylines with hearts, right?
Yes, there are. And it's one of those things where we have this stereotypical idea of the fairy tale. You know, there's a beautiful princess and a handsome prince, and they have some sort of adventure, and then they get married and live happily ever after. And that's what I like to call the Disney version of the fairy tale story. And of course, there are a lot more different types of fairy tales that have been written throughout history. And the period that I study in particular, the 17th century, there was a group of women who wrote the most fabulously interesting fairy tales, sort of pushing beyond, you know, what happens after the marriage point? Like if we continue the story a little bit further on, what happens? And perhaps not surprisingly, there are a number of sort of tragic outcomes where love does not conquer all, or in fact, you know, it does for a while and then everybody gets sick of each other. And there's this one fairy tale, which is almost, I think, my favorite. There is a prince who's turned into a rose bush and he can still talk. So he manages to convince a princess to fall in love with him because his spell is that he will remain a rose bush until the most beautiful person in the world falls in love with him. Of course she does. And they get married, but, you know, it just doesn't work out. They just get sick of each other. And then he wants to move on to somebody else. And so there's a range of different fairy tales like that. But I think the fairy tales that you're thinking of, in particular, the gruesome ones, they're the Grimms in Germany that come a little bit later. There's a little bit of violence in the corpus that I study, but not quite to the same extent. But you do have then sort of, you know, hearts being ripped out. And that's where you kind of really keep coming back to how the heart is such a productive symbol to look at, because it does have this association with thinking and feeling, but then it's also considered to be sort of the core of your being. So it's like the worst thing you can do is to rip somebody's heart out. And to use a really like contemporary and perhaps less gruesome example is, you know, Frozen fairy tale. You've got Anna and Elsa, two sisters, and the sort of one of the most dramatic points in the fairy tale is when the elder sister hits the younger sister in the heart with ice. And that is going to cause her to freeze to death because as the magical troll explains, well, you know, I can do something about the head, but the heart, no, I can't undo the magic in the heart. The only thing in that fairy tale that can solve the issue is an act of true love. And so you've got the heart as the core of the self and love is central to that, continuing on and on from medieval and early modern times to now. The twist in that being, of course, that it's sisterly love that is the solution to the story, but it is the heart that is at the core of the sisters' beings.
Oh, this is fabulous. Well, let's talk a bit more about the feeling heart. So those of us with a bit of a foot in the discipline of the history of emotions might not find that concept of the feeling heart unusual, but for a broader audience, perhaps both of you might be able to unpack that concept of the feeling heart a little bit more for us.
Yeah, I think we decided to use that phrase because we wanted to engage explicitly with the idea that the heart is used in reference to emotion. And so love is the obvious one, but hearts are also associated with courage. They are associated with grief. They break when, you know, things go wrong. And so we wanted to kind of use our collection, our discussion to explore all the different ways that people use the heart in discussions about emotion and to think about what that relationship's about. You know, why is it we think the heart can break, or why is it that when we talk about love, we think that is happening there? And we can also think in comparatively, why not the liver? Many cultures, the liver does lots of emotional work. But for Europeans, the heart, I think, is possibly one of the more important organs for helping us think through emotions, explaining them and articulating them, I guess.
And I think the other advantage with the concept of the feeling heart is that it captures both the idea that the heart is the place where feelings are located in the body, but also the idea that the heart feels, like that the heart has its own sort of agency beyond something that we understand. There's that sort of mysteriousness, particularly around things like love in my corpus of stories. It's just like grappling with, well, how do people fall in love and why and what does it mean? And the feeling heart kind of just allows you to play around with the two concepts, like the heart as a container for emotion, but also, well, the heart is doing some thinking and it's doing some feeling and it's doing other things as well. And how do we understand that?
That's fascinating. And like I'm kind of going a little bit off piste here, but I know in the early modern period, like physiologists like William Harvey, who were doing a lot of the first studies of circulation, were they informed a lot by this idea of the feeling heart in terms of their hypotheses of how circulation worked inside the body? Was there like a really strong link between the science and the anatomy and the emotional center of the heart?
It's a great question. I think yes, and the person who really studied this is somebody called Faye Bound-Alberti, and she wrote a history of the development of heart science about cardiography and things. And she says yes, and she says that what happens is you have these wonderful metaphors for how the heart works in the body, and because those metaphors are so much part of culture, when scientists come to look at the heart, they are thinking through those metaphors, and so they both describe the science in those ways. So you describe it as a pump that kind of pushes out, blood through the body and into the lungs. Some of them think of it as a hearthstone or a heat, and especially in models where the heart is something that produces heat for the body. And they're actively using these kind of everyday objects, but these metaphorical ideas to help articulate what the heart does to each other. But it's almost like in some ways you get trapped in your metaphor, because if you don't have other languages and other ways of thinking about the heart, then you can't push the science forward. And so new ways of thinking about the heart also help scientists to see what's there and allows them to take them in new directions, I guess.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Just the link between the two. And I love that point you said about, if the metaphor, if you get too pigeonholed in that metaphor, you pigeonhole the science as well. So you kind of have that tunnel vision and it prevents you from looking at other ways. So it's fascinating how intricately they're tied. Let's kind of dive into some detail now. So there's a couple of kind of quotes and sections we've kind of pulled out from the book that we really kind of resonated with. And I think the first one is this idea that the heart as a porous icon. And to me, the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of leaking heart valves, or people who've got heart valve failure, where the blood starts to go back the wrong direction because the heart valve's starting to leak. But maybe can you guys elaborate on what you mean by this idea of the heart as a porous icon?
Well, I think it's got a number of different meanings, similar to this idea of the feeling heart. But for me, and perhaps this is not the most obvious one, but I think it's really useful as an idea of thinking of the heart as like a flexible symbol. And I think of porosity as this idea of flow or movement. So the heart is not sort of a fixed or a static constant, but it's subject to change. And it is, in many of the sources that we looked at, it's a site where emotion and cognition and knowledge and judgment all sort of mingle together. And it's kind of the sense of the heart of being changeable and able to be affected by and have effects on. So for me, it's that idea of porosity is this idea of movement and change.
I think I'd add to that also about the kind of removal of boundaries. So porous hearts, like a porous stone sucks in water, right? And I think for me, like a lot of, maybe especially in the medieval, but a lot of our discussion around hearts for me were hearts that kind of sucked in ideas from other places. And then, so the meaning of the heart got denser over time, because it didn't ever give much up. I think that's the interesting thing. As a symbol, it kind of got richer and richer, and some meanings drop off, but that doesn't seem as clear. It just seems to get much more complicated, much more interesting. So it's that sucking thing.
It's kind of like a sponge, a porous sponge, just soaking up all this meaning over time, and how we've, probably a very layman's explanation of it, but how we kind of understood it as an emotional center has just grown and grown and gone richer and richer over time. Is that kind of what you're trying to say?
Yeah. That's what's nice about symbols, right? They get more complicated.
And I suppose if you bring it back to that sort of visceral heart, when you're talking about it, soaking up all those ideas, I'm just thinking, what if it bursts, this porous, vessel bursts, and it will be so full and so explosive. And I think, you do, people do talk about their hearts exploding within them, which is just one facet of that over full heart, full of ideas and full of emotion and full of, metaphorical sort of, wealth. So yeah, it is. I really like that idea that it's sponging all those things into it, and I think staying with some details around the book. What I found really fascinating, and if you've got the book and you're reading along at home, I'm going to page 12. So I'm going to read it so I get it correct. The feeling heart was the site of an emotional self, both embodied and extended. Its history begins with love, but extends to encompass the breadth of human emotional experience. And to me, like, that is an absolutely, just crystallizes a lot of the thinking that resonated with me. But perhaps, you could speak to this idea a little bit more about where you thought this was sitting.
Well, for me, I think one of the reasons we focused on the heart is that there was this really strong sense that the heart was kind of the starting point for understanding the self. And it was kind of this sort of origin. And it was the site, as a quote you've read out, for emotion, both within the body, but then also like the social consequences of emotion. And that's sort of, I think, where we came to the divisions of the chapters within the book. So we had a section looking at sort of meaningful hearts. So these were examples of sort of a heart-centered discourse. So really deep diving into the symbolism and the iconography of the heart. And then we also had this sense of hearts, their corporal or material aspect, and how they were an embodiment of not only sort of life source, but the way that bodies and selves move through that life and how things changed for them over time. And the third group of articles we had is this idea of productive hearts. So the hearts that do something, and that something might be the production of an individual's relationship or the formation of a family group or larger groups within society themselves. And so we see how hearts, they mean something both at an individual level and beyond. And it's not just about an abstract idea, but it's about the embodied life of a person and how they relate to the other hearts and embodied people in their immediate, intimate circle and also more broadly.
I think that's a great summary of the book and the project and what we were trying to get at there.
Yeah, I think it really sparks ideas that when you're talking, I'm just thinking, yes, that's fun. I can see that happening. And even the literal responds to what you are saying, because for all those sort of clinical scientific minds who might be listening to us, if you've ever taken part in an ECMO procedure, which is where they have that extra corporeal sort of management of the blood flow and oxygenating the blood flow, it's this leaky heart, but it's leaking across the whole room. It's the work of that heart has been taken outside, and it's like everyone can touch that person's inner heart, their inner person, because it is flowing in and out of them. And again, I think that speaks to what you were saying about, boundaries and being able to think past boundaries. I think if you thought that we could manage heart flow out, external to the body, 100 years ago, that would have been too much, for people to, we needed to be able to think of the heart as you know, it's in a different context. And I think this is what you're bringing out really well here. I'm sorry, I'm just overexcited listening to it, and I'm this is my flow of consciousness, so I'm going to back off now. That was a fantastic answer and really got me thinking. Thank you. I'll pass over.
I like where you're going with that, Bri. It's really interesting that you're taking this leaky heart to a different place. And I was also really interested, Bronwyn, in your comment about kind of inter-heart dynamics. So how hearts and embodied themselves relate to other hearts and people in their immediate vicinity, in their families, in their social circles, their communities. I think that's also a really fascinating point. I'd love to sort of talk more about that too. I also wanted to raise a topic that we've kind of actually touched on earlier. So Charles Porous, we find out in your collection, conceptualizes the heart as a battlefield. And this is chapter 4. And in this kind of conceptualization, there are different forces competing for control of the feeling subject. And this is a very intriguing notion. And I've got every time I read this, I just have that 80s song in the back of my head. You know, the Love is a Battlefield. Is it 80s? Am I completely getting the date wrong?
I'm not sure about the date, but I know the reference you're making.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's I've just got that in my head permanently now. But I was wondering, I don't know if this is more of a question for you, Bronwyn, if you can tell us a bit more about this concept of the heart as a battlefield, I guess, metaphor, and kind of what is vying for control of that space.
Yeah, so, well, in the dialogue that I'm looking at, and so it's written in French because Charles Porros was French, but I'm writing in English. And so the title of it is like a dialogue between love and friendship. And there's two sort of important contexts to note before we dive into the detail of it. One is that it's written in the tradition of the philosophical dialogue. So it's a sort of back and forth exchange. And the second is that it was not exactly entirely clear why it was written, but the way it's framed indicates it was part of the salon tradition in the 17th century. So the sort of very intellectual, fun, worldly conversations and gossip, literature, poetry, all of that mixed in together. And the way that I read this dialogue and understand it is that it's Poros's contribution to an ongoing conversation about love and how emotion is understood. And so if you kind of get to the end point of the century and you look at the publication of all these fairy tales, they're really trying to grapple with these ideas about what does it mean to love and fall in love, and how should people behave when they're in love, and there's gender and power and everything tied up in there. We take a step back to this dialogue. There's an introduction to it at the start, which is a letter, and it's Porros kind of explaining his reasons for publishing it and putting it down. And what he sort of talks about is that, I'm responding to Salon questions about love and friendship and how this all works. And so in this context, what we're sort of seeing is that on the one hand, it's a serious engagement with ideas about love. On the other hand, it's a story that Porros telling to kind of show off in the salon context and show how he can, explain something in an entertaining and witty way. And then that's how the sort of salon story comes together. And so it starts off and he says, I'm going to give you a genealogy of love and friendship. And he gives a very long sort of complicated story, but in essence, love is the elder brother to friendship's younger sister. And it's an interesting blended family. Love's parents are desire and beauty, whereas friendship's parents are desire and goodness. And so we're getting into all of these really rich ideas about love being sort of passionate and domineering and controlling, masculine through and through. And then friendship is, sweetness and generosity and very feminine and kind of pleasant to get along with. And so they both feel aggrieved by the way they're treated in society, and it goes on about other things. But the thing that really struck me when I was reading this dialogue was how the heart was conceptualized. And love is very much just like, the heart's mine, I sneak into them, I take control, and this is my territory. And he gets very cross with reason, because reason is also wanting to be in charge of the heart. And what love, bless him, says that, everything would be fine. We could get along if we could just choose what parts of life we'd like to control. Like, I'll be in charge of pleasure and, you know, fun things and all that sort of stuff. And then reason, back out of that, you can be in charge of, you know, the mind and intellect and all the serious, boring, important things. And so according to Love, well, the problem arises when reason's trying to encroach on his territory, which is rightfully his. And what comes out of this, aside from all of these really rich metaphors about the nature of love being something that you are subject to and that takes over you as a conquest, is very much this idea that the heart is almost an empty container. The heart itself in this dialogue has no agency whatsoever. It's either love coming in and stamping the territory or reason taking control, and the heart's not involved other than it is the place where these emotions take up residence, which I just found really, really interesting, and trying to figure out what the ongoing implications are of this is tricky. But I think what it is, it's an intervention in an ongoing debate. And so it's interesting as a standalone piece, but it's actually quite interesting when you look at it in the context and other novels at the time, sort of Madeleine de Scudéry's work in particular, clearly, and she's got some fabulously rich heart imagery and metaphors as well. And that's much more happens in a different plane. It's less about conquest and battle and more about, you know, the heart as an emotional landscape, and there's a certain path that you must tread in order to end up at your intended destination. But when you come back to Porous, we've got battle, conquest, domination.
It's interesting that the both of them are kind of looking at it in kind of spatial terms, just very, very different spaces. So emotional landscape versus battlefield. I think just even that understanding of the heart as kind of I guess a metaphorical place, figurative place, I think that in itself is absolutely fascinating. And I was wondering, when this kind of discussion of the heart as battlefield, I have a couple of follow-up questions. Is that so that's kind of an unusual characterization of the heart for the period? And also Poros's audience, you mentioned the salon. It's not something I know a lot about. Is what's kind of the gender makeup of kind of the intended audience? So I'm just thinking about the masculinity of love, the femininity of friendship, and I guess the conventional masculinity of this battlefield image.
Well, I'll start with the second one first, in terms of the salon. So the salon in the 17th century is very much a female-centric space, and it's this idea of private spaces within the home. So salon, the actual term, refers to a sort of small, intimate space, and they were places where sort of noble, wealthy, elite conversation were taking place. But the difference was that it was the seigneur, she was in charge of who could come, and people were there sort of to create conversation to impress her and the other sort of assembled guests. It develops much more throughout the 18th century to be more of the sort of like Enlightenment space and sort of development of like a public sphere. But in the 17th century, it's much more sociable conversation and very literary as well. There are other sort of rival discussions of science and more learned, but the salon is much that I'm talking about is a lot of women, a lot of conversation, a lot of literary sort of like the performance of literary text, and then the publication of texts that come out of those sorts of performances. And it's looking at things like collaborative authorship as well. So that's sort of a round table, like someone would come up with a concept, and then it's sort of a riffing would sort of take place. Like you can tell in my thesis, which actually it was published in another one of Katie's books. There was two versions of the same fairy tale by two authors, one with a happy ending, which was Porous, and another with an unhappy ending. And so there's this idea of a central conceit that then multiple people give their version on in order to kind of show how literary they are. Now to go back to the first question in terms of battlefield, I don't think it's one of those, this is the only person who's ever had this idea. I have a sense that there is other sources with the same idea, the names of which escape me at the moment. But I do think that it's drawing on a tradition and contributing an individual perspective rather than coming up with a completely novel idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Because I was thinking about, Shakespearean references to the, Much Ado About Nothing, The Merry War. So this idea of love as a conflict, but the heart as the actual side of the battle is intriguing. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. It's really wonderfully interesting work.
That's right. And I found there are a few more references to other similar ideas in the chapter. So I'll leave you to read the chapter to find it.
Absolutely. I found that fascinating, Bronwyn. I think something you mentioned there about this idea that, you've got love and reason fighting over the heart itself. But I think you said the heart was, I think it might be paraphrasing, but it was kind of this empty vessel. And they were trying to fill it or trying to take it over. And physiologically, I mean, you could make the argument that physiologically the heart is kind of empty. You take the heart out, if there's no blood, it's not connected to anything, it is empty. And I'm probably reading it way too literally here, but it relies on the blood circulating through. It relies on the connection to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. It relies on all of these influences in order to control what it does. And it responds to all those influences, but if you take it out, really the only thing you can do is beat very brief for a brief period of time and then stop. So you kind of in the body have all these things fighting over the control of the heart as well. So I find it fascinating that there's this parallel in with the terms of the emotional and the thinking and the reasoning side as well. Katie, I have a question for you now. In chapter 8, Susan Broomhall speaks of cardiotaphs, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, where she reiterates the accepted commonplace that the heart was the principal organ of feeling, giving vital spirit and heat to the whole body. But can you explain to our listeners what a cardiotaph was?
Yes, it's kind of gruesome and cool at the same time. A cardiotaph is a container for your heart. And when you died, actually for a long period of time, from the medieval right actually through to the 19th century, very often it was quite challenging to move your body, especially like bodies decomposed very quickly and we didn't have good technology for preserving them. But sometimes you wanted to, send part of a person home, right, if they were away, or to a family member, or you wanted to bury a part of them in a particular place. And so they have this thing called heart burial. And so they remove the heart and they put it in a container and they send it to where they want it to be kind of commemorated and held. But kind of from what was probably a practical function in some ways, also came about just lots of people then use the heart and containers containing the heart as these kind of funerary monuments. And so often you'll have a large statue dedicated to a rich and famous dead person, but within that, at some point in the statue will be the container that actually contains our heart. And sometimes those hearts are still there even to these days, right? And it's interesting because it's not like you see it in the medieval, you see it in early modern, but there's genuinely cases from like late 19th century France of some very famous people whose hearts become monuments, and then the public all go and rush to see them and things. So it has a very long life, the cardiotaph.
That's amazing. And you're right, it is kind of gruesome, this idea that they're actually removing the heart and preserving it on its own and not relying on it staying inside the body. It's fascinating.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the cardiotaph. So I'm just going to bang on a little bit more about that, because I do think it's, the heart is such an abstract, such a conceptual idea, and we know it as a semiotic site of meaning, and yet this is visceral. Like, so someone has had to do a thoracotomy to get it out. I mean, it's not easy to get the heart out of the chest. I've seen people try, and it's literally not easy, and it's very, very gruesome, and I would say a little agricultural as well, So the fact that someone has to do that, sorry.
Power tools, Claire, power tools. That's all you need to know.
Yeah. And it's a very sensual experience as well. The smells that happen when this is taking place, they're very powerful, and they're very, I would say, affecting as well. So, like how do you think people coped with that, the tension between those two very, very, polar sort of reactions to the heart?
I think people have a very different relationship to the body, though, and that it's kind of worth thinking a little bit about too. Because today we imagine you're both talking about living people having their hearts removed, and so you want to be a lot more careful. Where this is, a dead body, so you don't have to worry so much about how you do that, I guess. But also, normal people prepare dead bodies. I mean, they didn't go off to a funeral director. They weren't sent, somewhere nice and clinical and clean. Your family would prepare your body. Often the women in your family prepared your body for burial. And so they often did basic medical care. And the kinds of people who had their hearts cut out usually had a doctor do that. But these are doctors whose medical treatment often just involved cutting off a limb because it had gangrene, or managing infection with some very, to our minds, very brutal ways of kind of cutting things off. So I think that this is a sort of a medical context where people know how to, they're strong and physical, and they deal with the gruesomeness as part of life. And just because it's kind of gruesome and brutal in some ways, I don't think it means it's any less caring. I think, they see this as about saving lives. They see it as about taking the heart and preserving something of the person. And so there's a kind of reverence to medical care, even in its sort of its butchery, I guess.
I think, sorry, Bronwyn.
That's right. I was just going to say, I think that's true. And I think it also goes to underscore just how much the heart stands in for the self. So it stands in for both the sort of metaphorical, who am I self, and also the real human person self. And particularly in this sort of context, when it's, that is the part of the body that people are using to remember their loved one. So I agree with Katie, it sounds gruesome, but actually I think there's a raw beauty to it, in the sense that this is the way that the memory of someone could be preserved.
Absolutely. And I think you made an important point there, Katie, that we are removed from that sort of, I don't know if the word would be aftercare. We hand that on. When I started nursing, and I think Florence was still around, I'm just not sure, but I think she was probably practicing in the ward next to me. It's that long ago. But
Wait, hang on, was that a Florence Nightingale reference? I'm
Flo, my friend Flo. But we did, as student nurses, lay bodies out and take care of them. And we were taught very specific, routine habits of care and respect and reverence. And there wasn't that, and I'm looking for the right word, that it wasn't an end point where you hand it off to someone else. And I think that's lost a little bit in some modern societies, not all, because I know, in Ireland, that we will still have some of that, and we will have the open coffin in the house. My family, we still do that. And we're very connected as a culture to the heart, because there's those little pins that people wear, if they're abstaining from alcohol, they wear a little heart, for the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So they're physically wearing a heart on their lapel. Sorry, I'm pointing to the lapel because you were all psychically following what I was saying. So I think it is interesting that our habits are very much culturally and socially informed, and therefore our reactions to what you're saying in your book need this little bit of sort of just unpacking if you're not in that space. And I think this is really what's been fabulous about some of these ideas that we've been bringing out. So yeah, I love the cardio. Chaff, are we saying it properly? Cardio chaff? Yeah. I'll go with that.
Well, we are sort of coming towards the end of this discussion. I'm very sorry to say. I think I can probably throw in one more little question about the book, and this one is about chapter 6, where Claire Davidson discusses the heart in the medieval context as a site of emotional exchange between people and also within individuals, where within the individual it's an exchange from the exterior to the interior, from feeling to recognition. And I'm quoting there from page 124 for those playing at home. So another captivating concept there, and I'm wondering if either or both of you would like to kind of unpack this a little for us.
The one thing that I do really love about, I guess, the medieval way of thinking about the heart is the sense of which that your heart isn't your own anymore, and that we're, I think throughout this conversation we've been very metaphorical about the heart, the idea that people battle it or that we share it. We're thinking of it in metaphorical terms. But medieval people imagine in a sort of a kind of very visual way, like, so if you listen to a love song and it enters into your ear and it transmits into your heart, and a lot of the knowledge work that you do around that happens in your heart and shapes your feeling and makes you fall in love, or not, if it's the case maybe. But I kind of think what's really nice about that is it opens up this idea that our emotional connections with each other are not just separated by this boundary that is the body, that we're not, you know, when we talk about French philosophy, the modern French philosophy of people like Sartre, they talk about the other, and the other is always this person that you can't quite access. The other is often your lover, right? So in that sense, you're meant to be deeply intimate, but because they are never you and you can never be in their minds, we always see that there's a kind of fundamental separation between the two. Whereas I think for these kind of medieval metaphors, what they're kind of suggesting maybe that's not true, that maybe part of what love is, or part of what a connection is with somebody or with God, is that they really do enter into your heart and become part of you, and you go into them a little bit, and so you change and evolve, and because of that experience. And to me, I think there feels a bit of truth in that in its own sense, that, you know, if you have a long relationship with somebody, I think you both do change and evolve together, and so perhaps there is more of them in your heart than you often think about.
And I think there's another aspect too that builds on that, and that Claire talks about in her chapter, which is really this idea that the heart thinks, and that it is a site of cognition as well as feeling. And the way I understand her chapter is that she's really looking at, there is an idea that it's a place where the self prepares itself to either enter into a relationship with somebody else, as Katie's talked about, or to enter into the social world more broadly. So it's kind of this quite intimate personal space where there's so much going on, that is where a lot of all this symbolism comes from, because there's this conflict between the thinking and the feeling, and how that ends up getting expressed and then also negotiated in relation to other hearts.
Fantastic. Look, I think we're getting close to the end here. It's been a fascinating discussion, and look, we all really appreciate both of you coming in and joining us today. But before we sign off, what's next? Any plans? What's the plans for the future?
I have so many plans. Oh my goodness. I guess one that you guys might be interested in is I'm currently doing a Bloomsbury cultural history of blood. So we'll find out about the circulation part of this story.
Cool.
So that's kind of cool, I think. Other than that, I'm going to have to write this book about accounting. So that's a different kind of profession. We're moving away from that, but thinking about how we create emotion through our rituals and our repetition that accounting offers us, I guess.
I actually work in a slightly different field now. My current position is more education and reading. We're doing a big project on looking at how teenagers find books that they want to read for pleasure, and part of that is a survey and various other interviews and bits and pieces. So that's probably the next thing. And what I am working on that's sort of a little bit related to this is some of the social media aspects of it. So things like Bookstagram, BookTok and BookTube, and the sort of, I was going through the introduction of the book today. I'm just like, oh yes, the heart is the social media like. So I kind of just thought, well, there's it's tangential link to what I'm doing now, but it's still literature, but just a lot more practical and applied.
Well, and you're right, it is that link, because that you open with that, don't you? We heart things if we like them, and I have shamed myself by using that as a verb, because I think That's a terrible way to use the English language. But I do hear my kids saying, did you heart that on, Instagram, except they don't use Instagram anymore. But I think, it is that relationship, that's how we show our appreciation. So I think, yes, we could hear more from both of you in the future. So fantastic, diverse, full, rich conversation. Really appreciate it. Many, many thanks for having you, for coming to speak to us today. English has departed the building, but that's okay. And yes, good. The very best of luck.
Thank you for having us.